has anything to say about the deindustrialization of this country.
Georgian townhouses on the moon, the highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way. Small modular reactors under every village green. This is Anglo-futurism. Listeners, viewers, welcome back to the Anglo-Futurism podcast. We are with Meri Beckwith. Thank you for having us.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for having me. Are we on the space station yet, or are we still in transit? I can't tell.
Did you not notice the?
it's the gravity is like
it's so smooth. The transport.
Exactly. Yeah.
In fact, the flagstones actually are so dense that they drag you down. They have their own.
I thought it was just the centrifugal force of the rotation.
And what you've noticed, perhaps, is that it's just like your office at Lindus Health.
Yeah, it's really impressive.
It's a perfect
the VR technology you guys have up here is phenomenal. Yeah.
But Callum and I brought you here because I've been trying to pioneer a kind of technology. Callum here snores, and it's a nightmare. And I've invented a rather invasive practical treatment. But I want to get it to market as well.
Fantastic.
I want to sell it to consumers.
You've come to the right place, or I've brought myself to the right place. Yes. Well, you're going to need a clinical trial to see whether this rather invasive technology is safe and effective before it can be approved.
It is incredibly invasive.
and critically, it's necessary because if we don't get this through, the next thing that Tom will resort to is either a pillow or cyanide.
Yes. So I don't think the ethics committees won't probably. Yeah, that probably won't pass.
So what do we need to do to turn this invasive, unpleasant, humiliating treatment into something that people can just buy over the counter at Boots?
Yeah, and doctors can freely prescribe. Absolutely. So firstly, you would need to determine whether this counts as a medical device. Are you implanting something in Tom? Or is it some kind of device-enabled procedure? Or is it a drug? Yeah.
An immensely huge pill that he kind of forces down my throat.
Some kind of guillotine-based.
Exactly.
Let's imagine that I'm better at chemistry than I am, and it's a drug.
A drug. Okay, perfect. So there's a series of, you need to come up with essentially a preclinical data package. So before testing it in Tom and indeed any kind of in vivo environment, you would need to come up with a kind of a data package which describes, chemically what's in the drug, pharmacokinetic profile, what it does, etc. And then you would sort of give that to the regulator, which in the UK would be the MHRA, and they would then give you authorization to proceed to human trials. Often you would need to first test it in non-human primates, but I think that would be unethical.
Actually, at this point, Tom actually feels that it would be, unkind to do it. So unkind to do it in primates.
We're going to scale up to monkeys.
Okay, so let's say we're friends with people at the MHRA. We can go straight to Tom, our sort of our phase 1 clinical trial. You would typically then need to run a series of clinical trials in humans, traditionally phase 1, 2, and 3. Phase 1 is all about establishing safety. So, will this thing kill people? It sounds like in this case.
Again, for Tom, that really would not be the worst
safety
thing.
It's efficacious no matter what happens. Establish safety, and then phase 2 and 3 efficacy. So typically phase 2 is a combination of continuing to look quite closely at safety, but also maybe having a sense of like what the right dose is for the eventual marketed drug. And then phase 3 is like a scaled up trial with your the dose that you think works best on a larger population, typically kind of a well-powered randomized control trial to show that the drug works.
This all sounds very time consuming. and hazardous for the young biotech startup.
Yes, and for the patient. Yes, in this case.
and maybe so you founded Lindus Health specifically to address this problem, right? That the process of getting a drug from the bench into people's veins, stomachs, eyes, wherever is so challenging, because I think it's a misconception that people have, right? Is that we need to come up with more drugs. There is a huge backlog of molecules that people want to try, but the real bottleneck is getting through that like stage 1, 2, 3.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'll go on a bit of a rant here. So firstly, these stats are like almost a cliche in the industry now, but I'll go through them anyway. So on average, it takes about 10 to 12 years and costs $2 billion to take a drug, through the process that we've just described, right? So from discovery through to, actually being approved.
Any drug?
On average, the average drug, yeah. And the really scary part is that the timelines have been lengthening and the cost has been increasing exponentially. So it's been doubling about every 10 to 12 years.
This is what Eroom's law.
Eroom's law, yeah. And so I remember like learning about this in university. I think it was a lecture by Jack Scannell, the guy who kind of coined the term, and it is like a tech bro would say, like one-shotted me, right? And I was like, okay, how have we got this incredibly important industry that is getting exponentially less efficient, where all of the inputs to that industry, the cost of genome sequencing, cost of compute or whatever, are getting exponentially more efficient, and our understanding of biology is also improving, right? So like what the hell is going on here? And it's pretty obvious that it has something to do with clinical research, because the vast majority of costs to develop a drug are on the phase 1 to 3 clinical trials where you test it in humans. And this sort of question fascinated me in the early part of my career when I was investing in, medtech, life sciences companies. And I would ask everyone, like, okay, what's your take on, what's driving this terrible productivity problem in life sciences? And most people would say this kind of like, oh, well, maybe we've just like, discovered all the early targets, and all that's left is the snoring. That's really hard to drug, and that just seemed like terrible cope, right? Because it's like, oh, we've picked the low hanging fruit. And it's like, come on, like 30, 40 years ago, we discovered medicines like by zapping them into mice randomly, and now we've sequenced the human genome. You can whatever. So. But digging a bit deeper, and I actually joined a couple of clinical trials myself as a volunteer, and that was kind of when the penny dropped, because it was like stepping back in time 30 years. So one of them was one of the COVID vaccine phase 3s, and these are touted as like a big success story, and in some ways they are, but it was still like incredibly archaic and just chaotic on the ground. So I remember having to like download Microsoft Edge to even sign up for this clinical trial, because the website that the company running the trial had built didn't have an SSL certificate, so like basic web security, and so Chrome like blocks you from accessing it. And that sounds like trivial and silly, but that probably puts off like, I don't know, at least half of potential volunteers, which in turn makes it twice as long to enroll the study and potentially twice as expensive.
I mean, I've dropped out of clinical trials because you sort of like was doing some long-term flu vaccine.
Oh yeah,
and you just like find yourself, they'll call you up bizarre hours.
Yes, I had exactly the same thing. Yeah, some like call center like overseas, and it's just like, what am I being scammed? Like, what is this? Yeah,
really, really weird experience.
Yeah. So all of these things that seem trivial, they actually make a huge difference to pace of enrollment, so which is basically like the timeline, a big part of why trials take so long, and the cost. And it seemed obvious to me that like this stuff isn't hard to fix. Like people are spending billions on R&D to discover a slightly better molecule, a slightly better GLP-1, but actually I could just go and like through better website building, better processes, like have as much, if not a bigger impact on the cost and timelines to approve medicines. So that was kind of like the fundamental idea behind what has now become Lindus Health. Yeah.
Maybe at this point you can explain why it's called Lindus Health.
Yeah.
What relevance it has to. Can viewers see this guy?
Yeah. Hopefully our mascot James Lind. So in 1747. James Lind was a surgeon in the Royal Navy, and he ran the first ever randomized control trial to discover a cure for scurvy. And at the time, up to 50% of sailors on long sea voyages would just die of scurvy.
50%?
Yeah.
And then they're getting bleeding gums, and they're going
it's like horrible. It's
slightly insane beforehand.
Yeah, exactly. You your teeth fall out, your gums bleed, you just kind of waste away in front of everyone's eyes. And this was like considered
because they're
like,
eating chips,
tolerable.
biscuits, and
just
drinking
like tack and
grog
weevils
and
and stuff. Yeah. And James Lind was like, I just like this sucks. I have a bunch of theories about what could prevent this, and he ran
We've tried everything except eating fruit, and we're all out of ideas.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So he ran literally a randomized control trial with 6 arms, and one of the arms was oranges and lemons, and the sailors who got the oranges and lemons were all fine, and 50% of the other sailors died basically. And it's a pretty simple idea and process, but it had an enormous impact, obviously on health, but also on frankly, one
probably
of the
on world
key
trade.
innovations
That
literally powered the
the
British Empire, right? And another fun fact is that his RCT directly led to the formation of the Sicilian Mafia, because once the Royal Navy adopted this, the demand for oranges and lemons was so great that they basically they went to Sicily to get them, and the Sicilian Mafia formed as like a collective bargaining organization to kind of help the Sicilian fruit producers get a fair price.
One more thing that the empire, one more crime that we put at their feet.
Scottish physician flaps his wings.
But yeah, James Lind very much, I guess, an Anglo-futurist of his day. So yeah. And tying it back to obviously, so we look at the health system today with these like ever-increasing costs, and we understand way more than we ever did about a lot of these conditions. And you can just test. You can literally test and iterate your way to better medicines and better health in a lot of these conditions. And we think that hopefully in 50 years' time, we'll look back at the healthcare system today, and it'll seem just as ridiculous as like 50% of sailors dying on long sea voyages seems to us now. And like, why did we tolerate this? So that's all the lore behind James Lind. Yeah.
And this like rate of fallout. I mean, obviously there's a technical problem here.
Yeah.
Is it also just getting the people like along the way? It seems there are several stages, right? You've got to find the patients first, the healthy people, and then the people who are affected. Who for the sort of later stage 3 trials. You've then got you've got to do retain them. And then you've got to do the sort of processing to get them through. Like what stages of that are technical and what are like regulatory problems?
Yeah. There's definitely both, like technical and regulatory. So your typical clinical trial, let's just say phase 2 for the sake of argument. So, you might have 150 people divided into 2 groups. You've got to kind of design and plan the trial. So what are we going to measure? You've got to kind of source the physical sites, where are these people going to have the measurements taken, the hellish device or the drug
it's very large.
Forcibly inserted into them. What sites and investigators have the appropriate medical expertise and equipment to measure the effects of this hellish compound, and then you've got to find willing, or maybe not so, they have to be willing participants to take part. This is going to sound controversial to any of your listeners who are in this space, but I think the regulations are surprisingly permissive. You will get very precise regulatory feedback on exactly what you need to measure, and that is often like the hardest thing, because often the regulator will impose. You need to measure X, Y, and Z. Maybe those procedures are expensive, or it's tough to find sites who can effectively measure X, Y, and Z. But the regulations that govern how you conduct a clinical trial, how you monitor patients, are surprisingly permissive. And actually, you can literally go on the FDA's website and see briefing documents where they are admonishing pharma and organization, the contract research organizations, these organizations that were kind of disrupting, that run clinical research, where the regulator is admonishing these private companies for like not being innovative enough and not following, guidance that the FDA has put out to try and make them more innovative, which is pretty crazy, right? Like, what other industry is the regulator like trying to force the private for-profit companies to be more innovative? So I actually, organizations like the FDA, the MHRA do impose, that is sort of part of the problem. But I think a lot of the problem is self-imposed by the way the industry approaches these clinical trials. Yeah.
So let me try and put this in a nutshell. Maybe there's a pharmaceutical company like Bayer or whoever, and they want to test a drug. And so they go to one of these CROs, and it takes forever for avoidable reasons. And they could instead come to you, and you will speed it up, not through technological innovation, not because you're changing the legislation, but just because through better software you can make things faster.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some like technological innovation in what we do. It's a combination of better tech, better processes. Of course, we use AI to do things like generate, higher quality clinical trial documents, to kind of quality control like our protocols, to find patients more efficiently. So that's all, fairly cutting edge stuff. But then, of course, some of it is just better processes and better incentive alignment. Yeah.
And as we understand it, you're doing very well. It says here that you've raised $80 million. I assume that's
what it says.
Why doesn't it say pounds?
Look, unfortunately, the healthcare market is dominated by the U.S. For various reasons, and so now the majority of our customers,
all those sickly Americans,
all those sickly
wealthy Americans,
yep, sickly wealthy Americans. So we kind of need to play the game. Over half of, although we were founded in the UK
in 2021,
now,
so
yes.
It's very recent.
Yeah, but now like over half of our clients' clinical trials are in the US. So yeah.
And it does make one wonder: what are the drugs that are out there in the ether that people know about, that science has been working on, that just haven't made it to market yet? What kind of world could we be living in if
you would be shocked. I mean, so pharma, there are just umpteen compounds sitting on shelves at pharma gathering dust, and it's usually because no
one would ever be bald or fat or short or old or sick.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, maybe not quite to that extent, but there's like a treasure trove of kind of safe compounds that have maybe gone through phase 1, so that are safer than your more promising than your snoring treatment. I'm not sure if snoring is technically a disease unless you class. Anyway, that's a boring tangent. But anyway, so yeah, there are loads of kind of partway developed drugs or even devices sitting on shelves at pharma that have been shelved for ridiculous reasons, like one was a pet project of this guy who got fired and no one else wants to touch it, or we have this MPV threshold based on like an outdated view of the market, and because the way pharma runs trials is so expensive, it's just not worth our time to develop this drug. There are actually like an increasing number of I guess you call them biotechs, their deliberate strategy is, often using AI, but to sort of, buy these compounds from pharma and develop them themselves, either because they're sort of, they have an edge on picking them, or because they think they've discovered, off-target effects of that compound that maybe pharma missed, or they think they're, more efficient at getting them through the subsequent clinical trials, such that it becomes worthwhile. But yeah,
I mean that seems to explain the fact that we're not getting productivity increasing, but what explains like the decrease in productivity? Like that seems like there's almost some things are getting worse.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think a big part of it just comes down to incredible inertia, driven ultimately by pharma having huge regulatory barriers to entry, and thus very little competition, and thus little pressure to innovate. So I'll give some examples like both ways which illustrate this. Firstly, I mean, COVID vaccines, right? Like that was a huge success, and because there was for once intense competition, pharma actually moved much faster, and they conducted.
They did the 3 stages all at once,
Yeah,
right? I remember
basically.
this being like a great innovation that you didn't have to do it all consecutively.
But even if you look at the phase 3 stage was much shortened compared to a normal phase 3, right? So even accounting for the sort of running several stages in parallel. And they did that because they were actually under a lot of competitive pressure.
Did the rules change as a result? So that did we learn from?
I mean, the rules. Actually, this is kind of crazy. So the rules that changed were mainly around allowing more trial activities to take place in a remote setting, because a lot of healthcare, just facilities were like either locked down or were full of people with COVID. And funnily enough, that rule change hasn't been reversed, right? So the FDA has even widened guidance around what's called decentralized clinical trials. So running a clinical trial in a home setting. So giving you the hellish pill in the comfort of your own home rather than
I think it's a very large delivery device.
A faint comfort as I
expanding his nostrils.
As I choke in my own bed.
Yes. Well, look, hey, according to guidance, as long as you have
one pill down the top, basically.
If you have nurses present who can, if there's a serious adverse event, that's
hold him down.
And you can assure patient safety remotely. That's good to go.
Tom turns up in his white tunic.
Various oxygens bubbling away.
4 steps, please.
I'm afraid you might feel a little prick. And now that we've got this space opening up, what are the sort of the possibilities, right? Because it seems to me that we've got this stacking of the trials all together, and you've talked about the decentralization. What are the other ways that we are actually going to see productivity increase that doesn't just have this one step after another process?
Yeah. So I think the only way you'll see lasting productivity increase, maybe so I think there are 2 breaks to this. The first one is just you need to increase the competition in pharma. And I think the only way you can do that is by lowering the barriers to entry. What are the barriers to entry? There's the whole kind of clinical trial process, right? So making that, faster and easier, making it easier for, so what happens today is your biotech with the anti-snoring treatment, you would almost be forced to sell to pharma at phase 2, right? So before you've even gone through the full clinical trial process, because the whole process is so long that investors, there's just aren't many pools of capital with the time horizon to fund you for the whole 10 years. And because particularly the phase 3 trials are so expensive that you're kind of forced to sell to pharma so that they would run the phase 3 trial and then they would sort of pay to market and distribute the product. So our bet is by kind of shortening, potentially lowering the costs, or effectively lowering the costs by shortening this process. We can help more biotechs stay private for longer, stay more ambitious, and ultimately perhaps start to challenge pharma. Now you also have to think about the distribution. That is tricky, and obviously that is probably the most regulated environment on earth, right? Drug sales and distribution. But I think that's also changing with the rise of more and more conditions can be prescribed over telemedicine. GLP-1s have been huge for this. So hopefully there'll be a telemedicine service that will happily prescribe your drug to patients with severe snoring. But yeah. So I think we're not. I think we can have a huge impact on probably the worst part of this process and reverse this decline. But that distribution also plays a role. I do want to acknowledge our the fundamental kind of slowdown of essentially academic progress, I think also plays a role here. So if you look at Alzheimer's, this is one of the diseases with the highest burden worldwide, right? Where we have terrible outcomes and return on investment in R&D. We pumped untold billions into Alzheimer's drugs, and they've basically all failed.
This is fraud. That was because of the fraud,
exactly.
right?
That's what I'm getting at. So because our fundamental models for how Alzheimer's worked were basically wrong, because pretty much one guy, or not all, but like there's like one guy who was just like just blatantly doctored this key paper on Photoshop. Like it's insane. But this is just an example of how poor progress in our fundamental understanding of certain areas of biology has been contributing to a lot of waste, and thus this inefficiency in life sciences.
Although that slightly is different, right, from what you said about the low hanging fruit. And it's an interesting situation, right, because you've got all these new AI powered like drug development that haven't necessarily come out with the goods, or like the promises they made seem to have been somewhat like exaggerated, and actually they're finding this process harder. And you said there is the regulatory problem. If the trials aren't that regulated, but where is that regulation? Sorry, I don't quite follow.
So the regulation. So like for your snoring drug, there will be general regulations about how you have to conduct this trial. You have to get informed consent, of the patient before you test the drug on them. You have to get it approved, like the design approved by an ethics committee. You have to, monitor the trial for patient safety. That's all the stuff that kind of we do, all those general regulations are like actually pretty permissive. And this is where, the FDA has been good at saying, no, we want you to use software to monitor patients in real time. We want you to take a more pragmatic approach to how you run these trials. It's okay if you do them remotely, in your home. But you would also need the FDA to say like, okay, you're measuring the right things to see whether this drug works. And that's where, often the FDA will insist on measuring things that are quite costly to measure.
Sure.
So that's the conventional explanation for where regulation has driven an increase in cost. And there are some areas where that's true, but there are also plenty of areas where, like, I'll give you another example in like the liver disease MASH, which is super prevalent. It was very hard to do research in MASH, which is basically where your liver becomes fibrotic. It was very hard because the FDA insisted you had to do a liver biopsy to check whether you had MASH and whether it was improving, and that is like quite invasive and painful. But then the FDA a few years ago said, oh no, you can use this new technology to do like a liver scan, and it's way more efficient, and the whole field has opened up as a result. So you're seeing that happen. So hopefully that explains why, like, where regulation is driving some of this like decreasing efficiency. But it's a pretty complex picture, as you can see, right? It certainly doesn't account for an exponential on its own, like an exponential increase in cost for the last 60 years.
So you don't, and you do or you don't buy the low-hanging fruit is gone.
Oh, I don't buy that at all.
You don't buy
like
that
that's
at all.
Like, come on, like we compared to even 20 years ago, our understanding of human biology and the mechanisms that drive disease has advanced massively. I do like the Alzheimer's example. There are some fields where it's kind of stuck or where it's not moving very quickly. But again, like it's certainly not getting worse, right? Like,
although surely you can say like, just the like highly interconnected nature of biology just means that the number of easily accessible drug targets, like that as we also increase the like threshold for what we're willing to accept as a side effect,
it has to be better than standard of care. No, that's fair. I guess I'd reverse that slightly and say like in every other space, like digital tech, software, how you build great products is like rapid testing and iteration. And like every software product we've all used has probably been through like, I don't know, thousands of iterations, versions, A/B tested. And that doesn't really happen in life sciences. Like you have, phase 1, 2, 3, right? Or maybe, phase 1, phase A2, A/B, phase 3. And so if we make it easier to test and iterate safely, like it will just become much easier to produce treatments that are better than the standard of care. So maybe thinking about something like, like depression, right? Where, there are lots of potential causes, lots of potential mechanisms you could go after, and yet we've had very, very few advances in the standard of care for depression, basically because it's kind of it's just so expensive to run the large-scale clinical trials needed to test whether different interventions work. And so, that I think illustrates where this very inefficient, expensive clinical trial process has really held back progress.
And what would it mean for Britain, or for kind of the first Western country to nail drug testing?
Oof. Great question.
Well, the answer, someone been answered, right? He's going to the US.
No,
well, it puts us at the center of biotech, right?
Yeah, I think
it gives us all kinds of leverage.
So you would have.
We could create companies, the name eludes me, of that Danish company that invented Novo Nordisk.
No, yeah. I mean,
we start creating companies like that.
Yeah,
that's what's
exactly.
at stake.
Yeah, so that's they're now a third of Denmark's GDP, or actually at the peak, I think it was a third of Denmark's GDP or something. So truly incredible outcomes for the host country. I think just from a patient perspective, you would have patients who would benefit from groundbreaking new treatments, years or decades ahead of time. There would be tons of benefits. And the UK has an incredible, or should have an incredible advantage in this space. Genuinely, the NHS probably has the best health data set in the world for a number of reasons. So it's completely longitudinal from cradle to grave. It's all, in theory, one system. All the records, at least in primary care, are coded in the same way, so you can search them, and that's something we do. There are all these incredible advantages. Where the UK is not so good at the moment is on the market side, and just the NHS is not very good at purchasing and making these new treatments available to NHS patients. But yeah.
And this is where we get this problem, where the amount of R&D money that is spent in Britain has gone down. The number of trials that are happening in Britain has gone down.
But we spent a lot of money on genomics in this country as well, right? That must be
an
incredible asset to you.
The UK also has, the UK Biobank, which is probably, again, one of the best health data repositories in the world, and is a huge asset for people doing, clinical trials. The problem is that, it's the classic story of there's a lot of early phase research that originates in the UK, but when you're running your later phase clinical trials, you're giving half an eye to I want to run this in a place that's going to be a good first early adopter market once the drug is approved, and that unfortunately is not the UK. I think there are also specific acute problems with the NHS where a lot of these trials do just by necessity need to be run in NHS hospitals, and basically there's the way the system is set up, there's very little incentive for these hospitals to actually run these clinical trials, which is really sad. We would gladly pay the NHS more to run these trials faster, but there's no mechanism to do that. It's pretty crazy. And there's all this bureaucracy around contracting. All this stuff is pretty easily fixable, but it's been, anyway, I won't get into it.
Are you trying to get this stuff fixed?
Yeah. So realistically, there's not much we can do as an individual private company. I'll tell you what we do to get around it in a moment, but there are serious initiatives. There's the guy who's kind of at the head of this, a guy called James O'Shaughnessy, who wrote the O'Shaughnessy Report, who has very specific recommendations on how to fix a lot of this, which would recommend to all of your listeners back down on Earth. But the way we get around it is just creatively finding ways of running the trials that avoid going to, it really is just NHS secondary care, so hospitals. So we do a lot of research, firstly in patients' homes in the UK, because the UK has just great infrastructure and regulations around these decentralized remote clinical trials, and also in primary care, so in GPs. They're fantastic to work with. GPs are basically private companies, if you know this, and thus they're much more flexible and fast and easy to work with. Yeah.
Well, and so does again, to put this question of regulatory versus market, the NHS, it seems, would be a good customer, because obviously, larger, one of the largest purchasers of drugs in the world. Should then we need to align ourselves more with sort of American healthcare or like medicines approval? Like, is there a way where you could run kind of FDA approved trials in Britain and then you get NHS interaction? Or is it like what's the sort of, because obviously we're a smaller country. Like what's the way that Britain uses this, primary research and actually gets towards these larger scales?
Yeah, so I think honestly, the hardest part to solve would be either funding the NHS or like somehow incentivizing the NHS to like essentially pay more for drugs. Because today the NHS insists on paying less on average than even most of the European countries, because they think, okay, NICE has basically decided its role is to get the lowest price possible for these drugs, even at the expense of waiting 5 years, to acquire a drug that could be, life-saving for UK patients. But, we'll spend an extra 5 years negotiating £1,000 off whatever a course of drug, and you kind of think, is that worth it? Like, yeah, people in 5 years are benefiting, but there are people now literally dying who could have, who could have not died. So I think it would be fixing that and making like the UK a more attractive customer of pharmaceutical products. But then the easier stuff would be this stuff I mentioned around, maybe like allowing a mechanism for private companies to pay more to use NHS infrastructure to run their trials, and just fixing the contracting process. Because
that seems like a sort of perfect match, right?
Yeah.
That they want to pay to get into the hospitals.
Yeah.
You run in NHS hospitals, and maybe that's how you get the cheaper deals, is like through that process, right?
Yep.
So it basically requires an energetic.
Oh, I mean the
NHS.
actual. I mean the dream. The most like galaxy brained awesome scenario would be to. And this has sort of been tried, is like, look, we'll run the clinical trial, and, the NHS will like fund the entire clinical trial, and in return, we'll just like, be able to give it for free. You'll be able to get it for free on the NHS, right? And maybe the NHS will, earn money off royalties of sales of the drug in other markets. Like that would be. That would be an incredibly powerful self-funding mechanism. It would be incredibly accretive to like the British economy, but it would require some political will. I'm sure people would complain about like, oh, is the NHS now becoming an evil pharma company or something? But yeah, that would be an awesome idea. Yeah, and the infrastructure, it would just require policy changes to do that. There wouldn't be necessarily need to be any heavy investment in like talent or infrastructure or anything. Yeah.
I like the idea, and then the National Gallery gets its NHS wing. Sort of similar cultural output from the NHS across the world.
Yeah, I mean, look, if everyone's gonna like worship it like this sort of almost like there's a house not far from me in South London where they literally have, and they still have it up, like a kind of stained glass window in their front garden with like a religious scene with the NHS logo in place of like where the Godhead would like traditionally be found. And it just sends me like, as an American, that this like bureaucracy is like worshipped as this like omnipotent deity. So I'm sure
It does seem that there's quite a profound issue here of our tolerance of risk as a society, and we're very, very careful and conscientious in clinical trials, with the result that perhaps tens of millions of people right now don't have access to drugs that would massively benefit their lives.
Yeah, completely. I actually, I don't really think it's a tolerance of risk thing, because I think the regulations have overall an appropriate level of like, look, we're stepping in to like
because the disaster
risk.
is not that someone dies of flu in a trial, but that drugs that are lethal are distributed. A thalidomide sort of scenario.
But I think honestly, like the regulations, have an appropriate setting, like sins of omission versus commission, right? But I think
in that one is viewed as much worse. The sin of commission is
Yes, but I also
Implicitly,
think
we're much happier for people to die of a disease that exists than of a drug that misfires.
Let me put it this way: if all everyone did was run clinical trials in a way that followed the latest FDA guidance, you would be able to, using some of the techniques and stuff we do, you would literally be able to run trials, years faster, and maybe up to an order of magnitude cheaper. And that alone would, bring such huge benefits to general health, as to just totally change the equation and reduce a lot of the sins of omission, essentially. So basically, what I'm getting at is, I think it's there is some there are some regulatory barriers to achieving this bioabundance scenario, but I think the majority of the barriers are self-inflicted by the industry, and they're just they have an incredibly risk-averse mindset that goes beyond what even the regulations require. Does that make sense?
It does. And before we go for a break, can you tell us about some exciting drugs that are currently under in a testing phase, whether or not you're working on them as a company?
Okay, cool. I'll do. Oh gosh, where can I start? Let me do one. Let me do one that we're working on. So this is a treatment for MECFS, chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, chronic fatigue syndrome is a kind of quite prevalent but quite controversial condition, right? Because
some people think it's fake, right?
Well, be careful. I know people who've been received death threats for less. The leading clinicians in this space gets death threats for anyway. So, but the fact is that people are diagnosed with it. That there is a consistent kind of symptom pattern. There's clearly something going on here, right? Whether it's psychological or physiological. We're running a really interesting trial with a German pharma company for a treatment for this condition. It's actually a drug that's been approved elsewhere for another condition, so we know it's safe. And what's cool about it is we're able to do it in an entirely remote way, because the sickest patients with MECFS are literally, as you say, bedbound. And so, we've been able to set this up and run this in a way that it kind of runs in their home, which allows us to find the most sick patients, which gets around this problem of okay, there's this thing called MECFS. We don't know which of the patients actually have, this condition. And I think that's exciting because, frankly, I don't care whether it's, how the disease mechanistically works. I just care that we can run a kind of a proper experiment of a treatment. And if the experiment shows the treatment works, I kind of don't care how it has an effect, as long as it works, right? So I'm really excited about that because, realistically it is something, and certainly in this country, that is causing a lot of economic damage and just a lot of misery. So yeah.
I think there's definitely something in this, and I know, Tom, you want to take us out, but to briefly talk about what I'm doing of you've just got to do search, right?
Yeah, exactly. This is my point.
This is the Richard Sutton line, right? The bitter lesson of machine learning is you've just got to search, and actually you might not necessarily understand the mechanistic model, but actually it seems that time after time after time, just searching in this space gives you better results.
Yeah, it's the test and iterate thing. It's the same principle. That is how all great products are built. Is just constantly testing and iterating, learning with feedback, and it's just hard to do that. Or the industry has kind of forgotten how to do that, basically, or sort of stopped itself from doing that. So yeah.
Well, having attempted a first half of a podcast, we will go for a short break and then have a second try after a brief word
Phase 2
from our sponsors.